200 German women stood in formation between rows of boxcars, their uniforms stained the color of earth, their boots splitting at the seams, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion that comes not from a single night without sleep, but from months of collapse watched in slow motion. They had already been searched once that morning, rough hands through pockets, bags opened and emptied onto tables, blankets shaken until the dust rose in clouds, documents examined, names checked against lists typed on thin paper that tore easily in the damp air. They had stood for hours while American soldiers moved through the line with the efficiency of men performing a task they had done 1,000 times before. Now an American sergeant walked slowly down the formation, boots squelching in the mud, his voice flat and matter-of-fact as he spoke through a French interpreter who rendered his words into German. All jewelry must be removed. Rings, watches, necklaces, bracelets, everything. Place them in your hands, now. The words fell into the silence like stones into deep water. For a long moment, no one moved. The rain began again, a fine mist that settled on shoulders and turned the air gray. Some women instinctively covered their left hands with their right. One clutched at her throat where a thin silver chain disappeared under the collar of her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform. A young girl, she could not have been more than 19, began to cry without sound, her shoulders shaking. Among them stood Elsa Hartmann, 30 years old, a former bookkeeper from Bremen who had spent the last 3 years of the war as a clerk in Wehrmacht supply offices, tracking inventory that grew smaller each month as the Reich consumed itself from the inside out. On the third finger of her left hand, beneath layers of grime and the calluses that had formed from carrying suitcases and sleeping on floors, was a simple gold ring. Her wedding band. It was the last thing the war had not taken from her. Not yet. She felt the metal against her skin, solid, warm, familiar as her own pulse, and her stomach turned to ice. The ring had been on her finger for 6 years. She had worn it through bombing raids that turned Bremen into a landscape of chimneys standing alone in fields of rubble. She had worn it through the telegram that arrived in March 1943, telling her that her husband Otto had been killed outside Leningrad. His body never recovered. She had worn it through 2 more years of war, through evacuations and food shortages and nights spent in cellars listening to the city die above her. The ring had become more than jewelry. It was Otto's grave and his memory and the last proof that before the war, before the uniforms and the ration cards and the air raid sirens, she had been someone's wife, someone's choice, someone's love. And now the enemy wanted it. They had been warned this would happen. In the camps along the Rhine, in the makeshift holding pens where captured Wehrmacht personnel waited to be sorted and shipped west, the rumors had spread like fever. The Americans, soldiers whispered, took everything from prisoners. Gold rings melted down for their war fund. Watches vanished into the pockets of guards. Even gold teeth, some claimed, were extracted and sent back to America to be sold. One woman, a nurse from Hamburg named Greta, who had been captured 2 weeks earlier, had told the story over and over in their shared barracks the night before. Her voice carried the certainty of someone repeating gospel. "My cousin was captured in France last year," she said. "They stripped him of everything, his father's pocket watch, his wedding ring, even the silver cross our grandmother gave him at his first communion. He never saw any of it again. They take everything and they never give it back." Another woman had nodded in grim agreement. "My husband wrote from a camp in England. The British did the same. They call it processing. They write numbers in books. But the things disappear. Always." The Nazi propaganda had prepared them for this too. Radio broadcasts in the final months of the war had painted vivid pictures of Allied cruelty, Americans as barbarians in clean uniforms, British as thieves dressed in civility. One pamphlet Elsa remembered seeing in a Bremen train station showed a cartoon of a grinning American soldier, his pockets bulging with stolen watches and rings, standing over a line of skeletal German prisoners. The caption had read, "This is democracy's mercy." She had not believed all of it, of course. No one who had watched the Reich's propaganda grow more desperate as the armies closed in could believe everything. But some part of her, the part that remembered how quickly civilization had collapsed, how fast neighbors had turned on neighbors, how easily rules dissolved when no one enforced them, that part believed enough. And now, standing in the rain with an American sergeant ordering her to remove the one thing she had protected through 3 years of collapse, that part of her felt vindicated in its suspicion. Elsa had met Otto in 1937 at a bookshop in Bremen where she worked as a clerk, and he came every Saturday to browse the history section. He was a teacher, quiet and serious, with hands that always smelled faintly of chalk, and eyes that smiled before his mouth did. Their courtship had been proper and old-fashioned. Walks along the Weser River, coffee in small cafes, conversations about books and music and the future they imagined together. They married in 1939, in a small church ceremony just weeks before the war began. The ring he slipped onto her finger that day had belonged to his grandmother, a simple band of gold worn smooth by decades of being touched, turned, worried by fingers that were now dust. "It's not much," he had said, almost apologetically, "but it survived a lot. I think that means something." She had kissed him and told him it was perfect. 2 years later, he was dead in Russia, and the ring was all she had left of him. No body to bury, no grave to visit, just a circle of gold and a memory of chalk dust hands. She had promised herself she would never take it off. Through evacuations and bombings, through the chaos of the Reich's collapse, through the capture and the march to the railway yard, she had kept that promise. The ring had stayed on her finger through everything, a small defiance against a war that took everything else. Until now. The journey to this moment had been long and strange. Elsa had been captured outside Rams 3 weeks earlier, when the Wehrmacht communications unit she worked for had been overrun by American armor advancing faster than anyone had thought possible. One morning there had been orders and paperwork and the familiar routine of war reduced to bureaucracy. By afternoon, there were American tanks in the street and officers telling them in broken German to put their hands up and stand against the wall. She remembered thinking, with a clarity that felt almost like calm, that this was how it ended. Not with grand battles or heroic last stands, but with a clerk being told to stand against a wall while soldiers searched her bag and found nothing more dangerous than a pencil and a photograph of a dead husband. They had been marched to a holding camp, a muddy field surrounded by barbed wire where thousands of German soldiers sat in groups, smoking cigarettes made from newspaper and waiting for processing that moved with glacial slowness. The women were separated into their own section, guarded but not particularly watched. No one seemed to think they were dangerous. The nights were cold, the days were long. Food came irregularly, American rations that tasted strange, too rich after years of sawdust bread and watery soup. Some women refused to eat, convinced it was poisoned or contaminated. Others, like Elsa, ate mechanically, understanding that whatever came next would require strength. Letters were not allowed. Communication with families was impossible. They existed in a strange limbo where the war was over for them, but still continuing somewhere beyond the wire, and no one could say what would happen when it finally stopped completely. Then came the order to move. They were loaded onto trucks, driven to railway yards, transferred to boxcars marked with numbers and destinations in languages none of them spoke. The interpreters who occasionally appeared told them they were being sent to prisoner-of-war camps in America, a sentence that sounded less like information and more like the beginning of a fairy tale about a place that did not exist. America. Elsa had never met anyone who had been there. She knew it only from propaganda films and the occasional Hollywood movie that had played in Bremen cinemas before the war. A place of skyscrapers and gangsters, jazz music and racial mixing, excess and degeneracy according to the newsreels, but also, undeniably, a place untouched by bombs. And now she was being sent there, as a prisoner. For how long, no one would say. Elsa kept a small notebook hidden in the lining of her uniform jacket, sewn into a pocket she had made during the long nights in the holding camp. She wrote in it only when she was certain no one was watching, using a pencil stub she had found on the floor of a truck and sharpened against a stone. Her handwriting was cramped and efficient, the letters pressed close together to conserve space. Each entry was dated carefully, as if she were still a clerk filing reports. April 17, 1945, railway yard outside Rams. They are sending us to America. I still cannot make that sentence sound real. The interpreter said we would be treated according to international law, the Geneva Convention, which I have heard of but never read. One of the women asked what that meant, and the interpreter said it meant we would not be harmed. Another woman laughed bitterly and said the same law was supposed to protect civilians, and look how that worked out. No one had an answer. This morning they told us to remove our jewelry. All of it. Rings, watches, anything of value. They say it will be kept safe, returned when we are released. Released. That word sounds like something from another language. I looked at my ring and thought about Otto, about the day he put it on my finger, about the promise I made to never take it off. I do not know what to do. If I refuse, they may take it by force. If I give it willingly, I am betraying him. There is no choice that does not hurt. The interpreter repeated the order, his voice louder now. cutting through the rain and the murmur of frightened women. All jewelry must be removed. This is required for processing. Your valuables will be catalogued and stored safely. They will be returned to you at the end of your captivity. This is in accordance with the Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Prisoners of War. Geneva Convention. The words meant nothing to Elsa except that they were supposed to represent rules, order, some kind of civilization that still functioned when everything else had failed. But rules could be broken, papers could be lost, men could lie. The woman beside her, a secretary from Cologne named Margaret, slowly twisted a thin gold band from her own finger. Her hands were shaking. She stared at the ring as if it might disappear if she looked away. "My mother gave me this," she whispered, "when I married. She took it off her own hand and put it on mine." Elsa did not answer. There was nothing to say that would make this easier. The sergeant and his guards began moving down the line with a wooden crate and a leather satchel. The crate was divided into compartments, each lined with felt. The satchel contained cloth bags and small metal tags attached to thin wire. The first woman in the formation, a nurse from Munich, stepped forward when ordered. She removed a silver bracelet from her wrist and placed it in the sergeant's outstretched hand. He examined it briefly, then asked her name through the interpreter. She gave it. He wrote it in a ledger, then attached a numbered tag to the bracelet with wire and placed it in one of the cloth bags. "Number 47, he said in English, writing it beside her name. He handed her a card with her name and the number printed on it. "Keep this," the interpreter translated. "You will need it to reclaim your property." The process repeated. Name, item number, name, item number. The line inched forward through the rain. When Elsa's turn came, her feet felt like they had been nailed to the ground. Elsa stepped up to the makeshift table that had been set up under a tarp stretched between two trucks. Rain drummed against the canvas above. The sergeant looked at her with the same neutral expression he had given every other woman in line. Not cruel, not kind, just efficient. Through the interpreter, he asked her name. "Elsa Hartmann," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Date of birth?" "March 14th, 1915. The sergeant wrote both pieces of information in his ledger with neat, precise handwriting. Then he looked at her hands. She had curled her left hand into a fist at her side, an instinctive gesture of protection that fooled no one. The sergeant gestured toward it. "Ring," he said in English, the word needing no translation. Elsa forced her hand to open. The ring caught what little light filtered through the clouds, a small spark of gold against the gray day. She touched it with her right hand, turning it once around her finger. The motion was automatic, something she did 100 times a day without thinking. A nervous habit. A way of remembering Otto was still there, even when everything else was gone. The ring resisted at first. Her knuckle had swollen slightly from the cold and the weeks of poor food. She twisted harder, feeling the metal drag against her skin. A guard stepped forward, holding a small tin of soap. He said something in English and the interpreter translated. "He offers soap, to help it slide off." The kindness of the offer somehow made it worse. She shook her head sharply and pulled harder. The ring moved over the knuckle, scraping, and then suddenly it was in her palm, and her finger felt naked in a way that made her want to hide her hand. She stared at the ring. It looked smaller in her palm than it had on her finger, more fragile. Just a circle of worn gold that could fit between her thumb and forefinger. Nothing that could possibly carry the weight she had put on it. The sergeant held out his hand, palm up, waiting. This was the moment. The choice that was not really a choice. Hand it over or refuse and face consequences she could only imagine. Elsa thought of Otto, of the church, of the promise. Then she thought of her mother's voice from years ago. The living have to keep living, even when it feels like betrayal. She placed the ring in the sergeant's hand. He examined it with the detached attention of someone cataloging inventory, turned it over once, held it briefly to the light. Then he wrote in his ledger, "Gold ring, woman's, plain band, worn." He attached a tag, number 384, to the ring with thin wire threaded through the band. The wire was careful, not tight enough to scratch the gold. He placed the ring in a small cloth bag, pulled the drawstring closed, and wrote 384 on the outside of the bag. Then he handed Elsa a card. It was stiff paper, about the size of a playing card, with her name written in ink on one side and the number 384 on the other. "Keep this safe," the interpreter said. "When you are released, you will exchange this card for your property. Do not lose it." Elsa took the card with numb fingers. She wanted to ask questions. Where would the ring be stored? Who would guard it? What if the card got wet or torn or lost? but her throat had closed around the words. She stepped aside and the next woman moved forward. The cataloging continued for hours. The crate filled slowly with cloth bags, each one marked with a number, each number corresponding to a name in the sergeant's ledger. Watches, mostly, practical timepieces that had stopped working months ago, but which their owners had kept out of habit. Necklaces with small crosses or stars of David that had been hidden under uniforms. Wedding rings like Elsa's, some plain, some etched with dates and initials. One woman tried to keep her ring hidden, sliding it off and into her pocket instead of handing it over. A guard saw the motion and called the sergeant. There was a brief, tense conversation in German and English and French, all three languages tumbling over each other. In the end, the woman surrendered the ring, crying, but the sergeant made a note in his ledger beside her name. Elsa could not see what he wrote, but she saw the way the other guards looked at the woman afterward, their expressions harder. Lotta, a factory worker from Essen, who stood near Elsa in the formation, handed over a wristwatch with a cracked crystal. Her husband had given it to her when their first son was born. She had told Elsa on the truck. It had stopped working in 1943, but she wore it anyway because it was the only thing she had from him. Number 391, the sergeant said, attaching the tag. He handed Lotta her card. She stared at it with an expression that might have been anger, or might have been grief, or might have been both. I will never see it again, she said quietly, to no one in particular. Elsa thought she was probably right, but then the sergeant did something unexpected. He called over a young American corporal, barely old enough to shave, with red hair and freckles that made him look like a child playing soldier. The corporal was holding a metal box with a lock. The sergeant placed the crate of cloth bags inside the box. He closed it, locked it with a key he wore on a chain around his neck, and handed the box to the corporal. Then he said something in English, his tone formal and serious. The interpreter translated for the benefit of the nearby guards, not the prisoners, but Elsa heard anyway. This box is to be loaded onto Transport Vehicle 7 and accompanied at all times. It will be delivered to the property officer at camp processing. Any loss or theft is a court-martial offense. Court-martial, military discipline, rules with teeth. Elsa felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly, but something adjacent to it. A possibility that the rules they kept citing might actually mean something. They boarded the ship in Le Havre 3 days later. The harbor was crowded with vessels of every size, all flying the flags of nations that had won the war. American stars and stripes, British Union Jacks, the occasional French tricolor. The water was gray and choppy, smelling of salt and diesel fuel. The women climbed the gangway in single file, each one clutching the small bundle of possessions they had been allowed to keep. A change of clothes, a blanket, toilet articles issued by the Red Cross. Elsa kept her card with number 384 tucked inside her uniform pocket, her hand checking for it every few minutes as if it might vanish on its own. The ship was a converted troop transport, its holds refitted with rows of hammocks stacked 4 high. The air below deck was close and damp, the walls sweating condensation. Hundreds of women filled the space, their voices echoing off the metal bulkheads. Elsa found a hammock in the middle section and claimed it by placing her blanket inside. Lotta took the hammock below hers. Margaret, the secretary from Cologne, settled above. That first night at sea, as the ship rolled through swells that made half the women violently seasick, Elsa lay in her hammock and touched the empty space on her finger where the ring had been. The skin there was slightly paler than the rest of her hand, a shadow of the band that had protected it from sun and work for 6 years. She wondered where the ring was now. In what part of the ship? In whose custody? The metal box with the lock had been loaded aboard. She had seen it carried up the gangway by the red-haired corporal, who gripped it as if it contained diamonds instead of the worn belongings of defeated enemies. But seeing it loaded did not mean it would arrive. Ships sank. Cargo was lost. And even if the box made it safely to America, there were 1,000 ways for a small cloth bag to disappear between one continent and another. April 20th, 1945. Atlantic Ocean, 3 days out from Le Havre. I am on a ship crossing to America. If someone had told me a year ago that I would write that sentence, I would have thought them mad. The sea is rougher than I imagined. Many women are sick, vomiting into buckets that are emptied over the side twice a day. I have managed to keep food down, though the meals are strange. White bread that tastes sweet, meat that seems too fresh, coffee that is strong and bitter. We are fed twice a day, portions that seem generous, until I remember that my stomach has shrunk from years of rationing. I keep touching my finger where the ring was. The absence is physical, like a missing tooth that your tongue finds again and again. I dream about it last night. In the dream, I opened the cloth bag marked 384 and found it empty. Just air and broken wire. I woke with my heart pounding. Lotta says I am foolish to believe the Americans will keep their promise. She says valuables disappear in war, always have, always will. She says the cards we carry are just paper to keep us quiet during transport, that when we arrive there will be forms to sign acknowledging that items were lost in transit, and no one will be held responsible. I want to argue with her. I want to believe the system they described, the ledgers and locks and rules they kept citing. But I have seen too much to fully trust anything. All I know is that I had no choice. And maybe that is the worst part, not the loss, but the powerlessness. 12 days after leaving Le Havre, the ship entered New York Harbor at dawn. Elsa stood at the rail with hundreds of other women, staring at a skyline that looked like something from a dream or a propaganda film. Buildings so tall they seemed to scrape the morning sky, docks stretching for miles, all of it untouched by bombs. One woman began to cry, though Elsa could not tell if it was from relief or despair or simple exhaustion. Another muttered that it was obscene, this city gleaming while Europe lay in ruins. They were not allowed off the ship in New York. Instead, they remained in the harbor while supplies were loaded, food, fuel, mail. American soldiers came aboard to process paperwork, checking names against lists, stamping documents with official seals that meant nothing to the prisoners, but apparently meant everything to the bureaucracy that now controlled their lives. Then the ship moved again, this time down the coast and into warmer waters. 5 days later, they docked in Norfolk, Virginia, where the air was thick and humid and smelled of things Elsa could not identify. Flowers, maybe, or rot, or just growth in a climate that had not been bombed into sterility. Here, finally, they disembarked. The processing center was a series of long wooden buildings painted white, arranged around a central yard where American flags hung limp in the heavy air. The women were divided into groups of 50 and marched to different buildings for what the guards called intake. Intake meant standing in more lines. Medical examinations first, eyes, ears, throat, reflexes tested with small rubber hammers. A nurse listened to Elsa's heart through a stethoscope and declared it normal. A word that seemed absurd, given nothing about this situation, was normal. Delousing came next, in a separate building that smelled sharply of chemicals. Their clothes were taken to be fumigated. They showered under lukewarm water that felt like luxury after weeks of sponge baths from buckets. Soap was distributed, real soap that lathered, not the gray blocks that disintegrated in your hands. Then came new clothes, gray cotton dresses, sturdy and plain, with the letters PW stenciled in black on the back. Prisoner of war. The letters were large enough to be seen from a distance, marking them clearly for anyone who looked. The final stop was the building marked Property and Records. This was the moment Elsa had been both dreading and waiting for since the railway yard in France. The property office was cooler than the other buildings, with electric fans mounted in the corners that stirred the air without quite dispelling the humidity. The walls were lined with metal shelving units, floor to ceiling, each shelf divided into numbered compartments. Inside the compartments were boxes, some wooden, some metal, some just stacked cloth bags tied with string. Behind a long counter sat an American warrant officer with steel gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that sat low on his nose. He looked to be in his 50s, old enough to have lived through the last war, and his uniform was pressed with creases sharp enough to cut. Beside him stood a younger clerk, also in uniform, who operated a typewriter with surprising speed. A third man, wearing the PW markings of a prisoner, served as translator. He was German, Elsa realized, probably captured years ago and now serving out his time in administrative work instead of hard labor. When Elsa's group entered, the warrant officer looked up from his ledger and addressed them through the translator. You will register any valuables that were taken at point of capture. This includes jewelry, watches, money, and personal documents. Each item is cataloged with a number. You will be given a formal receipt. Your property will be stored here until your release. This is required by the Geneva Convention, Articles 6 and 18, regarding treatment of prisoners of war and protection of personal property. Geneva Convention again. The words were starting to sound less like abstract principles and more like scripture, repeated until they took on the weight of truth. The women lined up. One by one, they approached the counter and stated their names. The clerk checked a master list transported from France, found their original property number, and then the warrant officer rose to retrieve the corresponding item from the shelves. When Elsa's name was called, her mouth went dry. Hartman Elsa, number 384. The warrant officer ran his finger down a page in his ledger, found the number, and walked to a section of shelving marked 300-400. His hand went unerringly to a specific compartment and pulled out a small cloth bag with 384 written on it in black ink. He returned to the counter, opened the bag, and poured the contents into his palm. Her ring. It gleamed dully in the electric light, exactly as she remembered it. No scratches she did not recognize, no alterations. Just a worn gold band that had crossed an ocean and emerged unchanged. Elsa's breath caught in her throat. The officer examined the ring briefly, compared it to a description in his ledger. Gold ring, woman's, plain band, worn, and nodded in satisfaction. Then he did something that surprised her. Instead of returning it to the bag, he held it out toward her. For a wild moment she thought he was giving it back. But then the translator spoke. "You may verify this is your property. Examine it to confirm there is no damage." She took the ring with trembling fingers, turned it over, looked at the inner surface where Otto's initials and their wedding date had been engraved. OHEK, 7.539. Everything was still there, worn smooth but legible. "It's mine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer took it back, returned it to the cloth bag, and placed the bag in a larger metal box that clicked when he closed the lid. He wrote something in his ledger, then prepared a formal receipt on a printed form. The form was remarkable in its detail. Her name, her prisoner number, the date, a description of the item, the storage location, a paragraph in both English and German explaining that the property would be held in a secure facility, that it would be inventoried quarterly by the Red Cross, and that it would be returned upon release or, in the event of death, forwarded to designated next of kin. The officer stamped the form with an official seal, signed it, and had the clerk witness the signature. Then he handed it to Elsa. "Keep this in your personal file," the translator said. "If you lose it, replacement receipts can be issued, but the process takes time. Your property is safe here. It will not be sold, traded, or confiscated. This is military regulation." Elsa took the receipt with both hands. The paper was heavy, official, stamped with multiple seals that suggested layers of bureaucracy she could not begin to understand. Behind her, Lotta was called forward, number 391. The officer retrieved her husband's watch, let her examine it, documented it on an identical form. The process repeated for every woman. No exceptions, no shortcuts. Each item accounted for, each receipt prepared with the same careful attention. They were transported by train to a camp in Oklahoma. 3 days of travel through a landscape so flat and vast it seemed impossible. Fields of wheat stretched to horizons that never seemed to arrive. Small towns appeared and disappeared, each one looking exactly like the last. Grain elevators, water towers, churches with white steeples. The camp itself was arranged in a grid. Rows of wooden barracks painted a pale green, surrounded by double fences with guard towers at each corner. It looked almost pleasant in the late afternoon light, more like a military base than a prison, except for the signs in English and German that reminded everyone where they were. Prisoner of War Camp the 27. Authorized personnel only. The women were assigned to barracks by groups of 40, given bunk assignments, issued blankets and tin cups and metal plates with their prisoner numbers stamped on the back. Everything was numbered, catalogued, tracked. That first evening, as they sat on their bunks in the strange twilight that seemed to last forever on the plains, Lotta pulled out her property receipt and read it for the third time. "They wrote down everything," she said, sounding almost offended. "The crack in the crystal, the scratch on the band, the fact that it no longer keeps time." "Maybe they are very honest thieves," Margaret suggested darkly. "They document what they steal so they can sell it more easily later." But Elsa, reading her own receipt, thought of the warrant officer's careful hands, the multiple signatures, the official seals. It felt less like preparation for theft and more like insurance, protection not just of the property, but of the record itself. She said nothing, though. There was no point arguing about intentions when only time would prove who was right. Camp life settled into patterns that were strange in their ordinariness. Each morning began with roll call at 6 a.m., the women standing in formation while guards counted them and checked names against lists. Then breakfast in the mess hall, oatmeal with milk and sugar, bread with butter, coffee that was always hot even if it tasted like metal. After breakfast came work assignments. Some women were sent to the camp laundry, washing uniforms for the guards. Others worked in the kitchens, peeling potatoes and carrots by the bushel. A few, like Elsa, with clerical skills documented in their service records, were assigned to administrative offices. Elsa found herself working in the camp supply depot, recording inventory, Blankets issued, soap distributed, light bulbs replaced. It was mindless work, the kind she could do without thinking, leaving her mind free to wander to places she tried not to go. She thought about her ring often. About where it was, how it was stored, who had access to it. The property office was in the main administrative building, visible from the depot windows. Sometimes she would see the warrant officer from processing walking between buildings, always carrying a leather satchel, always moving with the same deliberate efficiency. Once, during a cigarette break, she asked one of the guards, a corporal from Texas who spoke a few words of German, about the property storage. "Is it true the items are inventoried?" she asked, stumbling over the English word. "Counted? Checked?" He looked at her with mild surprise, as if the question had never occurred to him before. "I reckon so," he said. "Red Cross comes through every quarter to inspect. They check everything against the ledgers, make sure nothing's gone missing." He paused, then added, "Had a guy try to steal a watch last year, prisoner's property. They caught him because the numbers didn't match up. Sent him to Leavenworth. 20 years. 20 years for stealing a watch." The sentence seemed absurd, excessive, but it also suggested that the rules were not decoration. They had consequences. May 15, 1945. Camp Near 27, Oklahoma. It has been 3 weeks since arrival. The days follow each other like beads on a string, identical and smooth. Wake, work, eat, sleep, repeat. The war in Europe is officially over. We heard the news last week. Some women wept. Others stared in silence. I felt nothing, which frightened me more than grief would have. I think I have used up all my feelings, and now I am empty. We are allowed to write letters home, 1 per week, through the Red Cross. I have written to my mother in Bremen but received no reply. I do not know if she is alive, if our house still stands, if my letters are reaching her or disappearing into the void of a destroyed postal system. In the meantime, I work in the supply depot and I think about my ring. It sits somewhere in the property office, in a box with a lock, marked with number 384. I have my receipt folded in my personal file, stored with my camp records. The system says it is safe. The system says it will be returned. But I remember another system. Ration cards that promised food, air raid shelters that promised protection, a government that promised victory. All of them failed. Why should this system be different? And yet I find myself wanting to believe it. Is that hope or just exhaustion? In June, the Red Cross inspection arrived. 2 civilians, a man and a woman, both Swiss, both wearing the distinctive armbands of the International Red Cross, spent 3 days at the camp, interviewing prisoners, examining facilities, reviewing records. They carried clipboards and notebooks and asked questions with the systematic thoroughness of people who had done this many times before. On the second day of their visit, Elsa was called from her work detail to the administration building. She arrived to find a dozen other women already waiting in a corridor, all of them looking nervous. The female inspector, a woman named Berger, perhaps 50 years old, with gray hair pulled back severely, spoke to them in perfect German. "We are conducting interviews to verify that prisoner property is being handled according to convention requirements. This is routine. Please answer honestly. There will be no reprisals for complaints." They were called in one at a time. When Elsa's turn came, she found herself in a small office with both inspectors. The man, Herr Müller, asked most of the questions. "Do you have personal property in camp storage?" "Yes." "A wedding ring?" "Were you given a receipt?" "Yes." "May I see it?" She handed over the folded form. He examined it carefully, comparing the information to a master list he had brought with him. "And do you believe your property is being stored safely?" Elsa hesitated. It was the kind of question that seemed simple but carried weight beneath its surface. "I don't know," she said finally. "I was told it would be safe. I have not seen it since processing." Herr Miller nodded and made a note. "Would you like to verify its presence? We have authority to request viewing of stored items." The question caught her off guard. She had not known that was possible. "Yes," she said, "I would." An hour later, she stood in the property office with both Red Cross inspectors and the warrant officer who had first processed her. The metal shelving units had been pulled slightly away from the wall, and the warrant officer was systematically opening boxes and checking their contents against ledger entries, while Herr Müller watched and verified each item. When they reached box 384, the officer opened it and removed the cloth bag. He loosened the drawstring and poured the ring into Frau Berger's hand. She examined it closely, then read aloud from the receipt. Gold ring, woman's, plain band, worn. Elsa thought of Bremen, of cellar rooms and soup lines, of a mother who had sold everything to survive. She thought of the camp around her, the barracks with their stoves, the mess hall with its regular meals, the property office with its careful records. She felt no joy at the prospect of return, only a deep, bone-level exhaustion at the thought of starting over in ruins. Elsa's name appeared on a transport list in January. Group 12, departure, February 3, 1946, destination, Bremerhaven, British Zone. In the 2 weeks before departure, the camp became strange and provisional. Women who were leaving gave away things they couldn't carry, extra clothes, books, small items acquired through months of camp life. Those staying watched with a mixture of envy and relief. The night before her transport, Elsa wrote a final letter to her mother. "Dear Mama, I am coming home. I will arrive in Bremerhaven in March if the ship schedule holds. I do not know how I will travel from there to Bremen, but I will find a way. I am bringing very little with me, a few clothes, this paper on which I write, and something else I thought I had lost forever. I will explain when I see you. I am afraid, Mama, afraid of what I will find, afraid that the city I remember no longer exists except in my head. But I am also grateful. I am alive. I am healthy. I have survived. We will face whatever comes next together. Your daughter, Elsa." The morning of departure, each woman in the transport was called to the property office one final time. The routine was familiar by now. Name called, number verified, box retrieved from the shelf, contents examined against receipt. When Elsa approached the counter, the warrant officer, the same man who had processed her 8 months earlier, pulled box 384 from the shelf without needing to check the number. He had done this so many times by now that the locations were apparently memorized. He opened the box, removed the cloth bag, loosened the drawstring, and poured the ring into his palm. He checked it against the ledger one last time, then held it out to her. "Hartman, Elsa. Number 384. Gold ring, woman's, plain band, worn. Engraved OH, EK, 7.539. Your property, as recorded at intake." She took the ring with both hands. It felt heavier than she remembered, though logically she knew gold did not change weight. She turned it over, examining the engraving that was still there, still legible. The officer handed her a final form to sign, acknowledgement of receipt, confirmation that the property had been returned intact and undamaged. She signed without reading, because her eyes were blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Then, for the first time in 8 months, she slipped the ring onto her finger. It settled into the groove in her skin as if it had never left, and something that had been holding its breath inside her chest finally exhaled. "Thank you," she said in English, one of the few phrases she engraved interior, OH, EK, 7.539. She turned the ring over, found the engraving, confirmed it matched. "This is your ring, Frau Hartmann?" Elsa nodded, not trusting her voice. Frau Berger handed it to her. "You may hold it if you wish." The metal was cool against her palm. She slipped it onto her finger, just for a moment, just to feel the familiar weight. And something inside her chest that had been clenched for months loosened slightly. Then she removed it and handed it back. The officer returned it to the bag to the box to the shelf. The ledger was updated to note the inspection. Forms were signed. It had taken less than 5 minutes, but Elsa left the property office feeling as though she had witnessed something impossible. A system that worked, rules that held, a promise kept, at least for now. In July, Elsa's first letter from home finally arrived. Her hands shook as she opened it. The envelope was thin, the paper inside covered with her mother's handwriting, smaller and more cramped than she remembered, as if paper itself had become precious. "My dearest Elsa, your letter reached me. I cannot express my relief at knowing you are alive and well. The censors have cut parts of your letter, so I do not know where exactly you are, only that you are in America, and that you are being treated according to international law. This is more than I had hoped for. Bremen is unrecognizable. Our street is gone. The building where you grew up exists only as a cellar where 17 of us now sleep. Food is scarce, but improving slowly. The British soldiers who control our sector have organized soup kitchens. I stand in line each day for bread that is heavy and dark but edible. Your father's pocket watch, which I had hidden, was stolen last month while I slept. I wept for days, not for the watch itself, but for the loss of one more thing connecting us to the past. I have sold nearly everything else we owned for food and coal. Only a few photographs remain, hidden in the lining of my coat. I tell you this not to burden you, but because I promised myself if you were alive, I would tell you truth. We survive. That is all. Please write when you can. Your words are worth more than bread. Your mother. Elsa read the letter 3 times. Then she sat on her bunk, stared at the receipt for her ring, safe in its box on its shelf, guarded by locks and ledgers and military regulations, and felt a guilt so heavy it was hard to breathe. Her mother's watch had been stolen by neighbors desperate enough to rob the sleeping. Her ring was being protected by the enemy her government had taught her to hate. The world had become incomprehensible. The repatriation orders began in November 1945, 6 months after Germany's surrender. The camp commander assembled all prisoners in the central yard on a cold morning when frost made the grass crunch underfoot. Through a translator, he explained that the war was over, that the occupation of Germany was stabilizing, and that prisoners would begin returning home in organized transports starting in January. You will be repatriated in groups according to your home regions and availability of transport, the translator said. Priority will be given to those with verified family contacts in the western zones. Those with families in Soviet-controlled areas may face delays while arrangements are made. The announcement should have brought joy. Instead, the yard was silent except for the wind moving through the fence wire. Ellie had learned during captivity. The officer nodded once, formally. Safe journey, ma'am. Ma'am. Not prisoner. Not enemy. Just a person being wished well on a journey home. The ship that carried them back to Europe was less crowded than the one that had brought them to America. Fewer prisoners, more space, better conditions. The women had bunks instead of hammocks. Meals were served at tables. There was even access to the deck for air and sunlight. Elsa stood at the rail every evening watching the sunset over the Atlantic, turning the ring on her finger in the old, familiar motion. Other women stood nearby, doing the same, touching returned watches, clutching photographs that had been stored and returned, wearing necklaces that gleamed in the fading light. They did not speak much. There was too much to say, and no words adequate to hold it. The crossing took 14 days. When the coast of Europe appeared through morning fog, Lotta, whose watch ticked softly on her wrist, repaired by camp mechanics before her departure, stood beside Elsa and said quietly, "They gave it back." It was not a question, just a statement of fact that still sounded like disbelief. "Yes," Elsa said.